Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of Therapy Talks. It's Haley here. And before we get to the episode, I want to take a moment to tell you all about an incredible gift from Switch Research. Click the link in the description to give this episode to gain free lifetime access to the Self Love Masterclass. You get access to introspective journaling prompts that accompany the daily lessons and over 20 hours of guided journaling sessions by a licensed therapist. Plus, you get a digital version of the self love journal to use in conjunction with the video series. So don't forget to claim your free gifts today. On today's episode, we have Dr. Holly Sawyer joining us to talk about her work as an author, as a professor, and a licensed therapist. Our discussion today focuses around process addictions. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Awesome. Well, welcome, Dr. Holly. I'd love if you could take a moment and introduce yourself. That would be so great for us to learn more about you.
Sure. My name is Dr. Holly Sawyer, known as Dr. Holly. I am a licensed clinical therapist in the state of Pennsylvania. I currently reside in Philadelphia, and I have a solo practice called Life First Therapy, where I specialize in working with professional Black women who experience microaggressions in the workplace. And so I work with them on identifying healthy ways to cope that does not involve substances or picking up a process or behavioral addiction. And so by that, I specialize basically in addictions. I'm also a college professor. I provide clinical supervision to newly licensed therapists that are moving towards their LPC or their certification in addictions.
Wow, I'm humbled. That's so many different avenues that you're juggling and doing right now. It's so awesome. Maybe if you could, like, I really love when our guests come on and they kind of break down some of the big terminologies that kind of come up so that we all kind of are on the same page. So you brought up lots of different things like microaggressions, um, process addictions, all of these different sorts of things.
Sure,
Mhm.
sure. So, a lot of us, right, on the surface know what drugs and substances are, right? So that could be alcohol, it could be pills, it could be cocaine, if you will. But when we talk about process or behavioral addictions, we're talking about persons who may have a gambling disorder or someone who may have a use order. Or an addiction around internet, sex, porn, shopping, exercising. So we look at those as process or behavioral addictions. You spoke about microaggressions. So microaggressions could be in the form of a nonverbal or verbal, racial or derogatory slant. So for me specifically, I focus on a racial component, but it also can be towards someone's gender, how they identify. It could be towards someone's body inability or ability, right? But I specifically focused on the racial component. Some of the verbal could be, someone saying like, "Oh, you sound smart for a black woman," or "You sound so articulate for a black woman." A nonverbal could be if someone left a noose or blackface on someone's desk or in their dorm room, right? And so again, those are verbal and nonverbal behaviors.
hmm And so, if you would be okay, I'd love to hear about your journey as to why you kind of focused in those main spheres that you're talking about.
I went through that, and a lot of I think Black people don't realize, or even brown folk don't realize that you can experience microaggressions as early as the first grade. And for example, my daughter, she has an ethnic name. And so ever since she started school, the teachers found it very difficult to pronounce her name. And I would always tell my daughter, and I still do to this day, don't allow anybody to mispronounce your name because you have persons who come here from Europe and other countries, and their names are learned and they are pronounced correctly and well. But as far as Black and brown kids who may have a cultural ethnic name, it's now all of a sudden a mystery. I can't pronounce it, right? And so having had those experiences myself as a kid, um, I realized that they didn't stop once you were, out of high school. They carried on to college and they also carried on into the professional workplace. And so, having gone through therapy myself and having a couple of white therapists and experiencing microaggressions, I began to wonder, like, wow, how many people that look like me, Black females are going through the same experiences, but they're turning to substances to cope because they don't know how to necessarily manage it, handle it, navigate it, right? And it can be hard to feel safe in that space. So sometimes people self medicate. And so that is what pushed me to go into that. And then as a therapist, you're always told to like niche, niche, niche. And so I felt like that was my niche because, again, I had experienced it for just so long. And believe it or not, a lot of people don't even realize, even as a professional, like, oh my gosh, that was a microaggression. Yes, it definitely was.
And so your lived experiences kind of directed you. And like so often, like you're saying with therapists, it's like if you find like your niche or your area of expertise, you're able to kind of connect better and able to
Yes,
like market yourself better by having an area that you really are passionate about.
very true. Very
Mhm.
true.
And so I would be curious for you to kind of maybe go back to this process addiction because I think that I don't know for me, my lived experience, I don't really hear that terminology very much. It doesn't I don't think it really gets talked about a lot.
It
So
doesn't.
and so I'd love to like learn more about that in terms of like how do we differentiate between just like reasonable, say, amount of exercise or what would be a reasonable experience to go gambling? And then when is it becoming in a place of addiction?
Yeah. So to be honest, there's really no like real distinction if someone has a dependency versus an addiction. If we're looking at a process like gambling, or we're looking at a drug like alcohol, this it's the same signs, right? So if I'm waking up and the first thing I do is I go straight to, play the lottery, get scatch-offs, or go to the casino or do a combination of any of those things, I'm no longer providing the basic needs for myself, food, clothes, and shelters, because all of my money has gone to just that. I'm constantly, either lying and or stealing from persons that I know because I have to go and gamble. So it looks the same way if someone was, had an alcohol use disorder, but instead it's for gambling. You may not see this person for hours because they're either on a binge or they're in the binge as far as, again, if we're looking at drugs or alcohol, but it's still a binge if they're gambling because they're in a casino and you don't see them for hours. They're not picking up the cell phone. They may have turned off the cell phone. I've known people who have worn diapers because they're refusing to get up from either the slot machine or the poker table in order for them to literally stay where they are because, again, that's their addiction. So they're in the throes of it, right? And so when we look at um process or behavioral addictions, no, they're not talked about as much because a lot of times we kind of sweep them under the rug or they don't seem to be taken as serious because with drugs and alcohol, you can see it, you can smell it, and it comes off a certain way. It's shunned in society. And someone who may have a gambling, exercise, or any of those other process addictions, they can look and present very well, right? And you may never ever know, except for someone who may be in relation with them, whether it's a family member or a spouse, someone who may be a worker, a coworker, or a peer, so they can kind of see the signs. But again, it's not something that's so blatantly, um, I guess, exposed or out in the open if someone was on a substance or alcohol.
And all the stigma that comes with substance use in terms of like the drugs and alcohol, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And some people would say, "Oh," and then some people may shun you and say, "Oh, you really don't have a gambling addiction." If they were to come out and say, like, "I think I need help." And someone may not take it as serious because, again, it isn't a drug or alcohol, but it is very serious. If you notice, outside casinos, they have the bulletin boards, or even when you walk into certain spaces in the casino, like numbers to get help if you feel like you have a problem. But like, well, most persons who have a use disorder, they're in denial at first, right? Until either they realize themselves or there may be some type of intervention that's happening by a loved one, a peer or colleague or something like that for them to realize it. But then it's also ultimately up to them to get the help. But again, they have to be just in that mind space. And I think as a society, we have to pay attention to all things that people possibly can become or have a use disorder too, you know?
For sure. And you're highlighting like a very common thing with terms of mental health. There has to be that desire and engagement to create that positive change.
Yeah, it does. Because again, not everyone has a substance or use disorder. They just don't. But they may have a process or behavioral disorder, and we may not look at it as serious. And so I just encourage people, like, if you know someone who again has developed that use disorder, that addiction towards gambling, porn, sex, anything in along those lines, shop and exercise. I mean, like, really look at it and don't sweep it, under the rug because it's literally just as serious.
And so when I think about this, maybe now on like the brain level, is it correct in my understanding that it's highlighting that same rewards
Dopamine, oh
pathway?
my gosh, yes. Yes, yes. Um, Physically, they may not go through the withdrawals as you would, of course, a substance or a drug, right? However, the withdrawals will show up different. Well, not necessarily. Oh, okay, I'll say this: irritability, being angry, right? Don't want to socialize. So you can see those as well with persons who are going through withdrawal from a drug and a substance. Um, but then there are other physiological withdrawal symptoms that you would not personally get from just again from not if you stopped gambling or those other processor behaviors. But the irritation, separating yourself, being depressed, not wanting to socialize, again being angry, like if you were to say something to this person, they would just snap or just go off the rails for it, and you had all you did was just ask a question, right? So we can look at those type of things when it comes to withdrawals or symptoms that you may have with a process or behavioral addiction. Mhm.
For sure. And would it be ignorant for me to say that like exercise, for example, would be a lot different than something like gambling?
You know what? All the process, yeah. No, I don't think it's ignorant. And I'm glad that you asked that because that's an excellent question. Again, even though one's behavioral and or process and another one is drug or substance, they are very similar. So there's different types of drugs and alcohol, and then there's different types of processes and behavioral addiction. So no, exercise is going to be or look different than someone that's gambling, right? Like cocaine will be different from, an opioid. Yeah, totally, for sure.
Yeah, because I was like thinking, like, what are like the core morbidity like disorders or experiences with like a process addiction, especially something like exercise? I could see maybe there's more of a higher risk, possibly, I don't know, of like bulimia or anorexia if there is that over exercising piece.
So I think that will probably depend on the person. I have worked with college students who've experienced both of those, and exercise was not one of their things, but was what one of their things was OCD,
Mm,
right? They had the need to be perfect
right.
within their physique and how they looked. And so I had a client, a young lady who felt like whenever she went into the classroom that students would stare at her and they were thinking things in their head about her physique and what she looked like. So she went to the gym before, the campus gym before class, like after class, like she always had to work out because in her mind, she was fixated on that whenever she walked on campus or going to class, people were commenting on her physique.
Right.
So in her instance, she made sure that she ate well. So it wasn't a bulimia or anorexia thing. It was just this OCD where I have to have this amount of this and do this and look this way before I go out the door when I'm in the gym.
Right.
So I think it definitely depends on the person.
Mhm.
And they could have like you said, the bulimia or the anorexia, but I don't think that it's like a norm to be attached for someone who has an exercise use disorder.
Because I'm trying to like put myself in that shoes of like exercise to that point. Like I think we can all agree when we exercise, we do feel better, which is a good thing. It's healthy for us to exercise, right? And so yes, you maybe would get that dopamine release or the AKA like the runner's high, right?
Yep.
After like
Hmm.
doing that sort of thing. But for me, when I conceptualize something like gambling, I would see it as more of like the thrill of like, am I going to win or am I not? Or like that unknown or risk aspect versus the exercise wouldn't feel as like risky or exciting in that way, but that's my bias.
But it can be
Around.
it can be risky, especially if you are exercising excessively and then you're counting calories to the point where you're being deficient, right? So it can be. Again, it just depends on the person, but all processing behavior addictions have risk. The person who's gambling, they're chasing the dopamine of winning. And winning, no matter if it's $50 or $5,000, that is like, I have to chase it. And when it's not there, then I have to go back to try to get that dopamine rush again. So, um, yeah, I mean, it's definitely something, again, that is not talked about enough. I think gambling has gotten a little bit more recognition, but, we also look at anorexia and bulimia separate, but we don't look at, oh, well, exercising as an addiction, right? We don't look at shopping as such, we don't look at sex as such. Um, it can be talked about, but we don't really point as much attention as we should to process addictions because, again, everybody is not over or misusing a drug or a substance.
Mhm. What would you say the prevalence of these process addictions are?
To be honest, I could not put a number to it because, again, society kind of like not shuns it, but it's kind of swept under the rug.
Right.
And I can hide a process addiction more than I can. If I'm using or abusing a drug or alcohol. If I went gambling and took you with me, you possibly would know that I had an addiction. I don't necessarily have to tell you that I went gambling, right? I can ask you for money, you wouldn't think anything about it because I may have asked you once or twice, even paid you back. But you wouldn't know that I necessarily have a gambling disorder. Then there are people who exercise, same thing, right? You just wouldn't necessarily know. You just think that this person is really fit. They look great. They pay attention to their physique and they're healthy. But again, it's so much easier to just hide and sweep under the rug. And I think that if we look at the research, it's more prevalent than what is being presented, on the surface.
Yeah, and do you think with, like, online shopping, like, that allowed a lot more accessibility?
Ooh, yes, yes. Because if you think about online shopping or shopping in general, you think about people who hoard, right? Whether they're dumpster diving, shopping online, or shopping at a store, you talked about maybe having some type of mental connection to it. So we think about our hoarders, right? That's that's a compulsive shopping, right? Disorder, there you go, there. Um, or just people who basically hoard stuff. So there's always a connection, but like I said, not everybody turns to a substance. It could just be their thing, or the exercising, or the gambling, or the sex, or the porn, even gaming, right? I know that has picked up in the ages of 16, persons who are like in high school, like 16 to 21, young adults with the gaming. And I don't know if the pandemic kinda spiked it just because we were at home more, but, um, that has been in research lately with the gaming addiction picking up.
Mhm. And I could see why, like, all of these things would be easy to fall, like, too far into, because, like, we can all probably conceptualize and understand, like, who hasn't gone to a store, gotten a really good deal on something, and was like, "Yes, like, I'm so happy I scored such a good sale," or whatever else, and that can be really thrilling trying to, like,
Yes.
chase that or find that. So, I could definitely
Yes.
see how it is, and, like, even myself, I'm like, I always like to, like, add to cart, and I just, like, try not to check it out, Like, so it's like, "Oh, I just get to look, and there's no damage," like, it's just sitting there in cart, and then they get really good nowadays because 'cause you'll get an email back, and they're like, "Oh, like, we noticed that you left things behind, like, in your cart," right? Do you think also with, like, social media, that's also probably made an impact on some process addictions because we're so aware of, like, what other people are doing?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Social media is very impactful no matter what area you're looking at. So, yeah, it always plays a role because it's not like social media is a machine that runs on its own. It's ran by people who have all these accounts on these different sites, right? And as we post and share things, yeah, it can definitely have a huge impact.
For sure, or even just, like, the example of, like, a Stanley mug, like, everybody has one, and then there's all the jokes about it and all of the kind of stuff that people carry their blenders around because how big it is, and it's as an
Yeah,
example, and
exactly.
it just, like,
Yeah.
spreads, and then you end up having things or buying into things because, like, you wanna be part of the group, or it can be really easy to just, like, conform in many of those ways.
You are so right, and I always encourage people to, like, if you find that certain people that you follow or pages that you follow are triggering, then you want to unfollow. Because if it doesn't make you feel safe or it triggers you to a behavior, right, or to pick up, and you know that you're working hard towards changing that behavior, then you probably want to unfollow that person. There are people I know who've totally left certain social media sites as well. So sometimes you have to go, and I won't call it extreme. I think you're just practicing, safety around your mental health. And so if it takes you from not following that account, that page, or coming totally off that particular social media account, you have to, do it for you. Because a lot of times people see things on social media and then it becomes a way of internalizing what you do or don't have or what you should look like. Or, now you're going down a rabbit hole and you don't even know how you got there besides just picking up and just scrolling, right? So yeah, social media is huge, huge, huge impact.
Hmm. And so, taking something like a process addiction, what main like therapy modalities would you use in practice?
So it really depends on on what's being presented as far as the issue and then the client. But for me, I like to look at motivational interviewing, right? Assessing where they are as far as with the change. Because if someone is in denial, then we're just kind of stuck in that space. But if they're contemplating and looking like, okay, I think I probably do have a problem, but I don't know what happened. I don't even know how this got out of control. I'm thinking about it, but I really don't know like how to go about this. Then you can work from there. I also am a big proponent of DBT, dialectical
Mhm.
behavioral therapy, because a lot of times it starts with emotional regulation, right? We're it's a dopamine thing. So we're after that high, right? But why are we connected to that thing to give us this high,
Mhm.
right? What can we put in place of once we take away the drug and alcohol or the processed addiction? Because if you take away something, you got to fill it in with something, right? And then we have to look at what emotionally could be triggering that I have to, again, go and pick up or go into that processed addiction. And so for me, I always try to sit with a client to understand where they are emotionally, and try to help them develop tools so that they can emotionally regulate if emotions are running too high or even too low. Because if you're depressed or anxious, you already know, again, they may self medicate in some form. Um, and then lastly, I like to look at narrative therapy because for me at least, I would like to know what was the narrative that maybe you grew up with within your family system or something that you've adopted as an adult as into how you got to where you are within, your process or substance addiction, right? So those areas are important for me when we look at modalities.
Right. And I could really see how like something like distress tolerance as well, because there's going to be that discomfort when we're not able to seek that rush or that dopamine high. And so we might
Yes.
or we might have to have the discomfort of sitting out on an activity. Like say it's a very non say it's just like a chill day and some of your girlfriends want to go to the mall. Maybe you can't go because it's just not you're not ready yet to be in that space.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mhm. And I think like that's some conversations I have had with clients who have faced substance use or like again some sort of especially where I am in the Okanagan here in British Columbia in Canada, we have like a lot of wine country. And so there's often this discussion about like limiting like wine, having wine and things like that. And then there's that immediate flip back of like, well, what am I going to do socially? Like, what am I going to do for fun? I was like, well, we also have a wonderful lake here in the summer. You can go swimming, you can go for a bike ride, you can go do a hobby and activity, but it doesn't necessarily have to have wine. So it's like that cultural aspect and that social aspect. So I could see why like distress tolerance, emotional regulation, or just the mindfulness aspect of like when is it starting to like ramp up into an unhelpful behavior again.
Yep, exactly, and that's why I love DBT because it literally has all of those components in meeting someone where they are. Because people don't wanna feel hurt, they don't wanna feel pain, right? They wanna soothe themselves, and a lot of that is within their emotions, a lot of it is somatic, right? And so that's why I love DBT because I could use those, different tenets to help that person who's experiencing all of that. And then going back to your point, if I know I'm going into a situation where I can't be active in again, maybe shopping or drinking wine, then what do I put in its place? Because a lot of times people do work with persons who have those use disorders and they take it away and they just know that they need to work towards recovery. But what are we replacing it with? Because 9 times out of 10, if they don't have something, then they're just bound to kind of go back to older behaviors.
And I could see a lot of discussions around purpose and like fulfillment and enjoyment in other ways would have to be had as well. Just like, who am I without this thing that maybe was taking up a lot of my time? And so, like, how else can I be my own self and have things that I can enjoy in a healthy way?
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I could
Sure.
see how maybe that would be maybe like a limiting factor or a block being like, well, if I don't have this, then what do I do? Right? And that fear of that unknown of like, what could someone do or engage in?
Yeah. Or I don't know anything else because I've grown up with this all of my life. And this is how I learned to cope because I saw my parents, right? Or caregivers do this thing. So this is a norm for me. So what do I do now? Right.
Do you
Hmm.
see like a lot of your clients having childhood trauma and then resulting in a process addiction?
No, it's a mix. Not everybody that I see have childhood trauma. They've had very good childhoods, or just no trauma, if you will, for example. But I've had professionals who have experienced trauma later in life, like maybe going off to college, not being away, I mean, being away from, home and things like that, or just having workplace trauma or situations. So everything is not, some of my clients, again, don't have childhood trauma, but just experience trauma later in life and has just been really jolted by that and just haven't had any experience with that. So to take that on, it's like, whoa, like how do you do this? And it kind of turns you, turn your world upside down. And then the persons who do have childhood trauma, not all of them necessarily end up with a substance use disorder or a process addiction, but you do have some, of course, that do. And so, again, looking for a way to soothe because they don't have those tools, yes, they do turn to process a substance or a combination of both, believe it or not.
Well, that would make a lot of sense with like a life altering experience, right? We'd really shift the way that we're looking for something, or so often we're avoiding or trying to find relief in
Yes.
something, right?
Yes. Yeah, yeah. And so you'll have, older adults who may have had, a loss of a child, not necessarily like due to SIDS, but it could be of a young adult child who's 21, 22, right? So they didn't have childhood trauma, but now they have this trauma at their older age. And it's like, how do I go through that? So now I just work. I work, I work, I work, I work. I don't do nothing but work. And then when people say, hey, let's go out, let's go to the beach, let's do things, I have now picked up a second job on top of my full-time job. Because if I pause long enough to even do anything socially, it may trigger me to think about, oh, these were times or things I used to do with my son who I've lost. But when I'm at work, my mind is focused on this project or whatever it is that I have to do. And it does not um, give me the pause to think about my son, if you will, or my loss. So now I'm just a workaholic.
Yeah. Do you think it's always been that way, that resistance to like feeling your feelings and like engaging with something in discomfort? Because that's so often like a theme I see is like, I don't want to feel it. I don't want to feel this discomfort. Like, just let's just avoid it. Let's engage in something else. I don't really want to confront that uncomfortableness.
I think it again varies person to person because there are some people who don't want to feel it at all and they never do. Then there are some people it comes in waves where they're able to talk about it a little bit, but don't go too deep because if they do, it'll just all come tumbling down. And then there are persons who are like, okay, this is showing up in different areas of my life, and I really just need to face this thing and start my grieving process, right? And so they've either been impacted by, again, their addiction or them having some type of use disorder. They've been impacted by something else because now they're looking like, okay, because I didn't handle this, it has totally impacted this, and now my world is just not the same. So yeah, I think it varies person to person, but I think naturally though, nobody kind of want to sit, in their pain at the moment. You know what I mean?
For sure. And do you find once individuals come with that process addiction, do you feel like they're quite committed, or do you find that like not a reflection of you as a therapist, of course, but that they're kind of very tentative about the therapy process? Like they're like, I'm just going to see, but you think they don't quite have that buy-in yet?
Yeah, and I think that's the case with a lot of clients though. Like, you have people who are just staying away from therapy and they're gonna figure it out on their own, however they choose to. But especially new clients that are coming in, whether somebody told them they have a problem or they feel like they have a problem, but they're not quite sure. I think there's always they're like, okay, can I trust this person? Am I really going to, commit to this process? Because if I hear something that I know is true and is painful, I don't know if I can sit in that because that's so uncomfortable for me. So yeah, it is. I won't say it's tricky, but I think a person has to again just be at least at the contemplation stage. Because if they're in total denial and they're just not really ready to shift or any movement towards a shift, it's just not going to produce any type of outcome or movement. But if you have someone on contemplation, you can work with that because with contemplation, we can take as long as you want to move you up the continuum.
Yeah.
But if we're at that point of denial, that first point, I don't know for me how much we're going to tug and pull and do this dance before you're there, right? And just because someone comes to a session, don't necessarily mean that they're ready.
Yeah. That's true.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to motivational interviewing, what are maybe some of your questions that you like to ask clients to kind of help open up more of that contemplation or help them to move up that continuum of change?
So for me, like if someone is in contemplation, I always ask them about, if they don't have if they don't see that, if they don't themselves identify as having a problem, then what has brought them here today, right? And so I always like to ask if they have other persons involved, like a children or a spouse, and then talking to them like, what do they say about, your gambling? How do they express them being impacted by your gambling? Um, I'll also ask them like, okay, if you are expressing that, this is becoming a problem for you, then if we don't make just one change this week, what do you think will happen or what will be impacted? So for them, it could be finances, it could be their job, it could be their marriages on the line. But it's just a lot of like, what questions and just asking them, again, how it impacts them, the individual, and then what they do impact those that they have a close relationship with. And so if there's no shift, then what's on the table for being lost or what's the risk of it all, right? Um, I think the questions that are MI based allows for the clients to have some level of introspection that they may not have had prior to coming in because your mind is just not again computing or focused on how what you're doing is damaging your life and or others who may be involved, right? So if we slow the person down in session and have them kind of have some level of introspection to talk about those impacts if changes are not had or made, then what does this life look like? Right? Are you comfortable with continuing with things, continuing to be this way if there are no change? And I know that may sound like a futile question, but I still have to ask because you're definitely here. You want something. Something is, a little unnormal, if you will. So let's dive into that.
Because in my understanding of motivational interviewing is to increase awareness and to increase like the impact or the awareness of the impact of what that person has on their own life and others around them,
Sure.
right? And also trying to maybe show the possibilities of positive change that could be available to them, right?
Yep, exactly. And so for me, I always do this thing, and I think I got this from Marsha, the
Yeah.
T chart.
Okay.
Because I'm such a DBT. I love DBT, but I learned from her besides the diary cards, she does this T chart, and it could be called something else. But the T chart is basically where you're outlining, like, okay, if things change, then what would that possibly look like? And if they don't, what does that look like, right? And so when they have that in front of them and they're working it out, they can juxtapose. And sometimes things look different on paper than when you're just also verbalizing it too. So I'm like a big teacher person. I just love like, okay, pros and cons, or if this is that, or I just love that whole process. Because again, I think when they're working through that and picking up some level of understanding, then it's like, oh, okay, I didn't really think about it this way.
Mhm. For sure. It makes it just really real. It really makes it.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's why I think so often I even have clients write things down just to like, okay, now that you've written it down and you're looking at it here, what do you notice about this? Like, I just want to make sure you're
Yes.
really informed of like what you're telling me and what's happening here.
Yes, yes,
You know,
exactly.
it seems almost a little harsh when I describe it like that, but it's like just giving a lot of clarity, and they're putting it in.
No, I think that's no, no, no. I think that's honest. No, no, I think that's honest. Adult stuff, some reality therapy. I think this totally honest because a lot of times we won't understand if something is irrational. Because it would make sense to me, right? And it would make sense to them. Whatever that is, and that doesn't mean that it hasn't served you, but if it's gotten you to this point where it's caused some harm, now we got to break down the irrationale of it, right? Um, and so again, that's why I love that teacher. When I was doing in office sessions, I would always have like the poster board and like I would make them like get up and write on it and we would like really talk it out and they would leave with that sheet and I'm like, go home, study this, look at it. Maybe you could have some other stuff to add to it for next session, but let's literally work out this T chart. So now it looks a little different because I'm mostly remote. So they may do it on their own scrap paper or on their journal, but we still do the T chart.
Mhm.
I think it's very, very important because again, sometimes you may not, uh, you may see something different versus when we're verbalizing it. So,
Definitely. I think that's just a helpful skill. So, would you recommend any other individual skills for maybe someone that isn't wanting to come to therapy this time, but they'd like to do their own practice?
so I actually have a workbook that's geared towards that sect of people. And so in the workbook, I have them identify just different mindfulness activities. I have some questions in there to help them kind of identify if they have experienced some type of trauma. What are some things that you can ask a therapist if indeed that you're kind of calling around, but you're still not quite sure yet? I heavily believe in mindfulness. I also have some CBT activities where it helps someone to identify what's an irrational, quote unquote, versus a rational thought, and what are some things that you may be saying to self sabotage, right? Or you may have imposter syndrome, or things that are thoughts that are not conducive. Because when we talk about trauma, it's not necessarily always like sexual, right? Sometimes someone could have survived an environmental, like situation where their house was totally wiped out from a tornado or hurricane. We think about Hurricane Katrina, person survivor of that, right? Having some PTSD, what does that look like? What are some signs when you know that you're ready to go to? I believe in journaling. Some people find that very therapeutic. For me, I don't journal anymore, but I'm heavily into mandalas. I love to now do the concentrated coloring. Um, it gives me a level of mindfulness like unbelievable, right? Um, and so a lot of times people who are not in therapy don't know a lot of the terminology and things like what you were saying. And so I also have a glossary in the workbook that points out what these terms mean in terms of when a clinician may diagnose you or talk about them in session. So, to your question, I think a person could at least, if they don't have access, to possibly Google like some mindfulness activities or some things around irrational thoughts and behaviors so they can get some level of understanding. Does that replace going to therapy? No, but it is something that it's a start, right? To again pausing and at least acknowledging that something isn't quite right. So how can I, get started with, smoothing things or managing things?
Definitely. And there's always a place to start. And like you're saying, like, thankfully, we do have access to internet in that way and that we can look up some base skills. And I always tell clients to like, if you're having a healthy lifestyle, if you're taking care of yourself, you're having self-care, that's even a great place to start as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because a lot of times people can't pause and practice self-care, or self-care is in the form again of a process or a substance, right? Dependency, not addiction per se, but dependency. So, you coming home from a long hard day or just a week, and so you're needing this thing to kind of like level yourself out. And again, there's nothing wrong with anybody who drinks a glass of wine or who moderately exercise, right? So that's not what I'm referring to. um but you just develop a dependency on this thing, right, or this behavior. Otherwise, you become anxious or depressed if it's not present, because again, you don't know how to self-regulate, or bring yourself down to a base level.
Definitely. And at the
Yeah.
beginning, you mentioned that you're a professor and that you teach some courses. So, what are some of the courses that you're teaching?
So all of the courses that I teach are addictions focused. And then for persons who want to move forward with licensure, I teach a supervision course, um, because I am the director for our Masters of Addictions online program here at a university here. And so, again, it could be substance use disorder, process addictions, because a lot of times people don't know the difference. We can talk about trauma in the family and how addictions tie into that. um, we do a lot of live simulations because the course itself is asynchronous, but I do have it built in where the students actually do mock therapy sessions with each other, right? And we discuss those sessions and things like that. So right now it's the summer, I'm teaching process addictions, and this week's topic, believe it or not, is exercise
Oh,
addiction. Yeah. Yeah, I
ironically.
know, right? So we and it's been very interesting because a lot of the students are like, wow, I didn't believe like all of this is, yeah, it's prevalent for sure. Yeah.
Definitely. And I also
Mhm.
saw that you had authored some books. Are they also on substance use as well or process addictions?
No, so the workbook is time to talk about trauma, like I mentioned, are for persons who are not quite ready to go to therapy yet, but would not mind doing some of their own work first. Even within them doing the work within their workbook, they can take that with them to therapy to say, like, hey, I noticed when I read this on irrational thinking, these are some thoughts that I have about myself, or some thoughts that I've learned, in my upbringing, in my family system, right? And this has led to, or I experienced this type of drama, and I understand now how this has led to my process or substance addictions. There are pages in there. So again, it's not solely in addictions, but I do have a section in there focusing and talking about addictions, right? Where people can get help. Um, I also talk about how addiction is different from dependency, things like that, so people can understand like where they may be. I do talk about self-care, because I do find that to be very important. I recently published um, on that, and what I published on was calling it targeted self-care. So a lot of times people will practice self-care, but it does not replenish or leave them refreshed because they're doing something that they have not identified to be helpful, either physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, or socially. So I could be fine physically, but I could be emotionally drained. So what are some things I can do to tap into my emotional self, right? And practicing self-care. Um, mentally, I could be burnt out, but emotionally and physically, I can be fine. So what can I do mentally to tap into that form of self-care that can help me? So I do a lot of presentations and speakings around that. And then my other book is called Get Your Mind Right, Get Your Money Right. It's a book for persons who are entrepreneurs or therapists seeking to go in solo practice. But what people tend to think is that, oh, if I have this amount of money, then my mind will be better or my mental health right will be better. But it's actually the reverse, because you can make all this money, you can get it. But if your mind is not in a safe space or thinking, all the money will just go away. It'll dissipate, right? And so I just encourage people to look at like, different things that may come up. And it's a lot of anecdotal um events that I've gone through that I'm sharing with persons. Like if you're going through this, right? Then this is what you can do. Another book filled with different types of exercises and things like that. So, yeah, everything for me is centered around people being able to have something in their hand that's tangible, being able to work in it and identify themselves with what it is that I'm presenting to them, and then go out and maybe do something to get a different result, versus when they first, bought the book. Yeah.
Definitely. And so if someone wanted to purchase one of your lovely books or connect or work with you, how could they find you?
So I am on LinkedIn and I'm also on Instagram. So on LinkedIn, I'm just basically Dr. Holly Sawyer. And on Instagram, I am Life First Therapy LLC. So that is my solo practice name. And then my website is lifefirstTherapy.com. And so I have both books there.
Wonderful. It's so lovely
Yeah.
getting to know you. And I learned so much today. And I
Yeah.
can see just how passionate you are. And I feel so lucky that I get to speak to you and so many wonderful therapists on this podcast. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you joining me today.
Yes, and I appreciate you having me all the way from Philly to Canada. So
Yeah,
yeah,
all
that's
the way
great.
up in the west coast of Canada for sure. I know.